Were the Middle Ages really just about knights, castles, and epic battles? What if we told you that behind the towering stone walls and amidst the fervent piety of medieval Europe, there existed a world of incredible dedication, an almost unimaginable commitment to a life of strict discipline and silence? What if some women chose a path so challenging, so utterly devoid of comfort, that it would make modern monastic lifestyles look like a luxury resort? Get ready to uncover the astonishing lives of medieval nuns from the 5th to the 15th century, who embraced austerity like no others. Number 1. The Carthusian nuns. Deep within the secluded valleys and remote mountain ranges of medieval Europe, there existed a monastic order so dedicated to silence, solitude, and austerity that it became the very definition of monastic rigor. While the Carthusian monks are widely recognized for their extreme reclusive lives, the Carthusian nuns, though fewer in number, embraced an equally demanding and profoundly solitary existence. Their story is one of unwavering commitment to a spiritual path that deliberately shunned the world and its comforts, often to an extent that few other religious orders dared to approach. Carthusian order, founded by Saint Bruno of Cologne in 1084, was born out of a desire for a return to the purest forms of monastic life, far removed from the growing complexities and occasional laxity of other established orders like the Benedictines. Bruno and his companions sought a life that combined the eremitical or solitary ideal with a communal structure, but one where the communal aspects were minimal. This vision, initially for men, soon inspired women who felt called to a similar path of extreme quiet and individual devotion. The first Carthusian nunnery, or chartreuse, was established in the early 12th century, with some sources pointing to Primol in France, founded around 1128 as one of the earliest. These women, like their male counterparts, were drawn to a life that stripped away everything deemed non-essential, leaving only God and the soul in direct, unmediated communication. The core philosophy of the Carthusian nuns revolved around absolute enclosure, perpetual silence, and constant contemplation. They were living examples of the desert ascetics, but within the confines of a meticulously designed monastic complex. Their life was not merely strict. It was an exercise in systematic self-denial and profound spiritual focus. The goal was to achieve a state of continuous prayer and union with God, unburdened by worldly distractions or even excessive interaction with their fellow nuns. This was a radical departure from many other female monastic orders which often emphasized community life, shared work, and more frequent communication. A typical day for a Carthusian nun began, not with the rising sun, but often in the deepest hours of the night. Around midnight, the solitary cells would stir to life as the nuns rose for matins and lauds, the longest and most solemn parts of the divine office. This nocturnal prayer, performed alone in their cells or sometimes in the chapel, was a demanding spiritual exercise requiring immense discipline to awaken from sleep and engage in prolonged psalmody and meditation. After this demanding vigil, they would return to their cells, perhaps for a brief rest, before rising again for prime at dawn. The cycle of prayer continued throughout the day, with terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline marking the hours. Each of these services, while observed communally in the chapel, was often undertaken with an emphasis on individual focus, with nuns returning to their cells immediately afterward. The enclosure of a Carthusian nun was among the strictest of any order. Once a woman entered a Carthusian chartreuse, she was, for all intents and purposes, dead to the outside world. Gates were rarely opened, and contact with family or visitors was almost non-existent, and certainly not direct. The walls of the monastery were not just physical barriers. They symbolized a complete separation from secular life. Even within the monastery, the nuns spent the vast majority of their time alone in their cells, which were not simple rooms, but rather small self-contained houses or hermitages, each with its own garden, workroom, and sleeping area. These individual dwellings allowed for maximum solitude and minimized communal interaction, a stark contrast to dormitories found in other convents. Silence was the very air they breathed, the fundamental rule governing their lives. Perpetual silence was the ideal, broken only for necessary communication with their prioress or during very specific, limited communal gatherings. Even during the brief moments of communal activity such as prayer in the chapel or a rare shared meal, speech was kept to an absolute minimum, often limited to necessary liturgical responses or simple essential instructions. The emphasis was on interior silence, creating an inner space where the nun could listen only to the promptings of God. This profound quiet was not a punishment, but a chosen path to deeper contemplation, a deliberate shedding of the noise and distractions of the world. Poverty for the Carthusian nuns was not just about owning nothing personally. It was about the very structure of their lives. They possessed no personal items beyond the bare necessities prescribed by the rule. The monastery itself, while providing for their basic needs, was designed for simplicity rather than adornment. Their sustenance came from the labor of lay sisters or from small endowments, but the nuns themselves lived a life free from any attachment to material possessions. They did not engage in begging, as mendicant orders did, but relied on the monastic enclosure to provide for their needs in a simple and unadorned manner. Their diet was extremely simple and austere. Carthusian nuns were vegetarians, strictly abstaining from meat and often from dairy products for much of the year. Their meals typically consisted of bread, vegetables, pulses, and occasionally fish, all prepared without excessive seasoning or richness. They ate only once a day for much of the year, with a lighter meal in the evening during certain seasons. Fasts were frequent and rigorously observed, often involving complete abstinence from food for extended periods or limiting intake to the absolute bare minimum. This dietary rigor was not merely for physical health, but a form of bodily mortification, intended to subdue the flesh and elevate the spirit. Sleep was kept to a minimum, often broken by the nocturnal prayers. Nuns slept on straw mattresses or simple beds, with little in the way of soft coverings. The aim was to provide just enough rest to allow for the demanding schedule of prayer and solitary work, but not to indulge in excessive comfort. Their physical discipline was interwoven with their spiritual discipline, seen as a necessary means to achieve spiritual purity. Their habit was simple and unbleached, typically consisting of a tunic, scapular, and cowl of rough undyed wool. There was no ornamentation, no pretense, just a functional garment that symbolized their humility, poverty, and separation from the world. The starkness of their attire mirrored the starkness of their chosen lives. Work for a Carthusian nun was primarily spiritual. Their work was the continuous practice of prayer, meditation, and reading of sacred texts. However, they also engaged in manual labor, but often within the confines of their individual cells or gardens. This could include tasks like spinning wool, making simple garments, or tending to their small garden plots. Purpose of this labor was not economic gain, but to provide a healthy balance to intellectual and spiritual pursuits, keeping the body engaged in humble tasks while the mind remained fixed on God. This was a deliberate effort to avoid idleness, which was seen as a gateway to temptation. The extreme nature of Carthusian life meant that there were never many Carthusian nunneries, and vocations were rare. Yet, those who entered were known for their profound dedication and spiritual depth. While specific individual Carthusian nuns might not be as widely known as some saints from larger, more outwardly active orders, the collective witness of their hidden lives was a powerful testament to radical asceticism. Chartresses like those at Primo, Gosnay, and elsewhere, though often modest in appearance, were fortresses of prayer and silence, attracting women who sought the most direct and uncompromised path to God. Their quiet influence was felt through the spiritual example they set, a beacon of contemplative rigor in an often tumultuous medieval world. Carthusian nuns represent the pinnacle of medieval female monastic austerity, a life chosen in utter devotion, almost completely hidden from the gaze of the world, yet profoundly able in its silent witness. Number 2. The Poor Clares. In the bustling, rapidly changing world of 13th century Italy, where trade was booming and cities were growing, a radical new form of religious life emerged, defying the norms of comfort and wealth that were increasingly permeating the church. This new way was centered on absolute poverty, a direct imitation of the life of Jesus Christ as preached by Saint Francis of Assisi, and among the most fervent adherents to this path were the Poor Clares, commune founded by Saint Clare of Assisi herself. Their austerity was not just about strict rules, it was about an entire way of living that rejected every possible worldly attachment, embracing a level of deprivation that was truly astonishing for its time. The Order of Saint Clare, commonly known as the Poor Clares, began in 1212 when Clare of Reggio, a young noblewoman from Assisi, was inspired by the preaching of her fellow townsman Francis. She famously ran away from her home, renounced her family's wealth, and, at the Porziuncola chapel, received her habit from Francis, dedicating herself to a life of radical poverty and penance. Soon her sister Agnes, and then other women, joined her, forming a community at the church of San Damiano, just outside Assisi. Francis initially provided them with a simple rule of life, one centered entirely on living without anything of their own, a concept that became the cornerstone of their existence. This commitment to absolute poverty was so central that Clare fought tirelessly, even against papal pressures, to secure a privilege of poverty for her order, which forbade any collective or individual possessions, meaning the community itself could own no property or receive guaranteed income. The core philosophy of the Poor Clares was rooted deeply in Franciscan spirituality, the radical imitation of Christ, particularly his poverty and humility. For these nuns, this meant stripping away all earthly comforts and attachments to achieve spiritual liberation and a deeper union with God. Their life was one of profound enclosure, ceaseless prayer, and manual labor, all undertaken in a spirit of extreme self-denial and joyful penance. They believed that by emptying themselves of all possessions and earthly comforts, they could be more fully filled with God. A typical day for a Poor Clare was meticulously structured around prayer work and silence. Their day began long before dawn, often around midnight or 1 a.m., with the chanting of matins and lauds sung together in their choir. These prayers, often lasting for hours, were followed by periods of silent meditation. As the sun rose, they would observe prime, followed by communal mass. The rest of the day was interspersed with the remaining hours of the divine office, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each hour was a call to prayer, ensuring that their lives were punctuated by constant devotion. The enclosure of the Poor Clares was exceptionally strict. Once a nun entered the convent, she remained within its walls for the rest of her life. Contact with the outside world was minimal and always supervised, usually through a grated turnstile or a heavy grille in the parlor. This enclosure was not seen as a confinement but as a spiritual barrier, protecting the nuns from worldly temptations and distractions, allowing them to focus entirely on God. It was a conscious choice to separate themselves from the world so they could better pray for the world. Silence was a fundamental pillar of their daily life. While not as absolute as the Carthusians, communication was strictly limited to what was necessary for daily tasks or spiritual direction. There were designated times and places for necessary conversation, but generally, a spirit of quiet pervaded the convent. Even during communal meals, silence was often observed, with a nun reading aloud from a spiritual text. This emphasis on silence fostered interior recollection and prevented idle chatter, ensuring that the nuns' minds remained centered on their spiritual purpose. Poverty, as mentioned, was the defining characteristic of the Poor Clares. They lived without any personal possessions, and the community itself owned no property. This meant they relied entirely on alms, on the generosity of benefactors, and on the fruits of their own manual labor. Their convents were simple, unadorned, and their furnishings sparse. There were no endowments, no fixed incomes. They lived truly from hand to mouth, trusting entirely in divine providence. This radical dependence on God was a continuous act of faith and a powerful witness to their rejection of material wealth. If donations were not forthcoming, they would go without. This was a direct, literal interpretation of Francis's call to poverty, which even the male Franciscans struggled to maintain in its initial purity. Their diet was extremely frugal. They abstained from meat and often from eggs and dairy for most of the year. Their meals consisted of basic fare: bread, vegetables, beans, and occasionally fish or cheese, all prepared simply. They observed numerous fasts throughout the year, often subsisting on just bread and water for days. During Lent and other penitential seasons, the rigor of their diet intensified. This constant denial of bodily pleasure was a form of penance and a means of fostering spiritual detachment. Sleep was minimal and austere. Poor Clares slept on hard beds, often with straw mattresses or simple pallets, in unheated dormitories. Their sleep was regularly interrupted by the call to nocturnal prayers. The intention was to provide just enough rest to function, but never to indulge in comfort or luxury. This deliberate lack of comfort was part of their mortification, a way to unite themselves with the sufferings of Christ. Their habit was a simple, unbleached tunic, tied with a rope cincture, a scapular, and a veil, all made from coarse, undyed wool. They wore no shoes, or only very simple sandals, even in harsh weather, in imitation of Francis' Penday. The roughness of the material and the simplicity of the design were outward signs of their humility and poverty, a visible declaration of their detachment from worldly fashion and comfort. Manual labor was an essential part of their daily routine. Since they owned no property and had no endowments, the nuns had to work to support themselves. Their tasks included spinning, weaving, sewing vestments for churches, baking altar bread, or tending to small gardens within the enclosure. This labor was performed in silence and with a spirit of humility, contributing to the upkeep of the community and fulfilling their vow of poverty by literally earning their daily bread. This work, though humble, was considered a form of prayer and an act of obedience. Poor Clares quickly spread throughout Europe with thousands of convents, established by the end of the Middle Ages. Notable figures like Saint Agnes of Assisi, Clare's sister, and later Saint Colette of Corbie, who initiated a major reform movement in the 15th century, restoring the original strictness of the rule, exemplify their enduring spirit. Saint Colette's reforms were particularly vital, bringing many communities back to the austere foundations of Clare's vision when some convents had become relaxed over time. Convents like San Damiano in Assisi, where Clare lived and died, remained powerful symbols of their commitment. The Poor Clares, through their radical embrace of evangelical poverty and their rigorous enclosed life, stood as a living challenge to the material ambitions of the medieval world, proving that true riches lay not in possessions, but in complete surrender. Their legacy is one of unwavering faith and a profound witness to the jodding power of asceticism. Number 3. The Cistercian nuns. In the late 11th and early 12th centuries, a powerful reform movement swept through the Benedictine monasteries of Europe, aiming to strip away centuries of accumulated wealth, ornate rituals, and worldly entanglements. This movement birthed the Cistercian order, founded at Citeaux in France in 1098. While their male counterparts, exemplified by figures like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, became widely known for their asceticism, their female counterparts, the Cistercian nuns, embodying a profound commitment to solitude, manual labor, and liturgical simplicity that set them apart even among other strict monastic orders. Their austerity was a deliberate return to the perceived purity of early monasticism, a stark contrast to the more relaxed Benedictine houses of the era. The origins of Cistercian nuns are somewhat less formally structured than the male order, as the Cistercian General Chapter initially hesitated to take responsibility for female communities. However, the spiritual impulse was too strong to be contained. Women inspired by the Cistercian ideal of ora et labora, prayer and work, and radical simplicity began to form communities that adopted the Cistercian customs and rule. Many existing Benedictine convents also sought to reform themselves according to Cistercian principles, and new foundations sprang up often near male Cistercian monasteries, allowing for spiritual guidance and economic assistance. The first formal Cistercian nunnery recognized by the General Chapter was at Tart-l'Abbé in France, founded in 1125, largely thanks to the efforts of Saint Stephen Harding, one of the founders of Citeaux. These women sought a life of profound retreat from the world, lived in remote, often wild locations, dedicated to self-sufficiency and unceasing prayer. The core philosophy of Cistercian nuns was a radical adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict, interpreted in its most literal and rigorous sense. They emphasized manual labor, liturgical simplicity, deep silence, and severe asceticism. Their spiritual aim was to achieve union with God through constant prayer, contemplation, and the purification of the soul through physical discipline and detachment from worldly comforts. They believed that a simple, unadorned life, lived in humble labor, was the truest path to spiritual enlightenment and holiness. A typical day for a Cistercian nun was meticulously structured around the divine office and manual labor. Their day began extremely early, often around 2 a.m. for matins, the longest prayer of the day sung in the monastic choir. This nocturnal vigil, often lasting for hours, was followed by lauds at dawn. The hours of tersext, nun vespers, and compline punctuated their day, drawing them back to the choir for communal prayer and psalmody. Between these prayer times, their lives were filled with work. The enclosure of Cistercian nuns was strict, though perhaps not always as severe as the Carthusians or Poor Clares in terms of absolute isolation from family. However, contact with the outside world was minimal and regulated. They were enclosed within the monastery walls, rarely leaving except for dire necessity or spiritual reform missions. The physical separation was intended to foster spiritual focus and prevent worldly distractions from entering their contemplative lives. Visits were highly restricted, usually through a grill, and conversations were brief and formal. Silence was profoundly important. Cistercian nuns observed strict silence for much of the day, especially during meals, work periods, and within the cloister and dormitory. Speech was generally permitted only when absolutely necessary for spiritual direction or during specific communal gatherings like chapter meetings. They often used a system of hand gestures to communicate essential needs. This profound quiet fostered interior recollection and prevented the dissipation of spiritual energy through idle chatter, encouraging a constant awareness of God's presence. Poverty was a cornerstone of their life. Cistercian monasteries, both male and female, rejected the opulence and landed wealth that had become common in some older Benedictine houses. They built their monasteries in remote, often uncultivated areas, symbolizing their withdrawal from the world. Their convents were simple, unadorned, devoid of unnecessary decorations or lavish furnishings. They aimed for self-sufficiency, relying on their own labor rather than large endowments. Nuns held no personal possessions, and the community's resources were managed with strict frugality. Their diet was rigorously austere. Cistercian nuns were vegetarians, abstaining from all meat, and often from eggs and dairy products for significant portions of the year. Their meals consisted of basic wholesome fare: bread, vegetables, beans, and water, or simple wine. They ate only once a day for much of the year, usually around midday, and observed numerous periods of fasting, including the entirety of Lent, Advent, and many other vigils and feast days. This severe dietary regimen was a form of physical mortification, designed to subdue the body and free the spirit for contemplation. Sleep was minimal and uncomfortable. Cistercian nuns slept on simple straw mattresses or hard beds in unheated dormitories. Their sleep was regularly interrupted by the call to matins in the deep night, ensuring that they never became overly comfortable or indulged in excessive rest. This physical rigor was seen as a vital part of their spiritual discipline, training the body to be subservient to the spirit. Their habit was plain and unbleached, typically made of coarse, undyed wool, consisting of a tunic, scapular, and veil. Color, often a grayish-white, earned them the moniker White Nuns, in contrast to the Black Nuns of the Benedictines. The simplicity of their garments reflected their rejection of worldly vanity and their commitment to humility and poverty. Manual labor was not just a means of subsistence, but a spiritual discipline in itself. Cistercian nuns engaged in extensive agricultural work, cultivating fields, tending gardens, and raising livestock. Though they did not eat meat, they also performed domestic tasks, spun wool, wove cloth, and produced crafts. This labor, often physically demanding, was undertaken in silence and humility, seen as a way to glorify God and contribute to the community's self-sufficiency. It ensured that their lives were balanced between prayer and purposeful activity, preventing idleness and fostering a strong work ethic. Cistercian nunneries spread rapidly across Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries, mirroring the success of their male counterparts. Important early foundations included Tarbes, l'Abbaye, Maubuisson, founded by Blanche of Castile, mother of Saint Louis IX, and Las Huelgas in Spain, which became a powerful and influential royal Cistercian abbey. While many Cistercian nuns living lives of quiet contemplation did not achieve individual renown outside their convents, their collective commitment to extreme asceticism and diligent labor made a profound impact. They offered a path for women seeking a rigorously disciplined spiritual life, contributing to the agricultural and spiritual development of the regions where they settled. Their enduring legacy is a testament to the powerful attraction of a life wholly dedicated to God through simplicity, hard work, and unceasing prayer, standing as a beacon of reform and spiritual intensity in medieval monasticism. Number 4. The Brigittine Nuns. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, a new and distinct form of monastic life emerged from the frosty lands of Scandinavia, founded by a powerful and visionary woman. Saint Bridget of Sweden, a widow, mother of 8, and a mystic, established the Order of the Most Holy Savior, commonly known as the Brigittines, in the mid-14th century. Her order was unique, not only for its innovative structure of double monasteries, housing both monks and nuns under the spiritual authority of an abbess, but also for its exceptionally strict rule which prescribed a life of intense intellectual and spiritual devotion, coupled with severe physical austerity. The Brigittines presented a profound synthesis of contemplative rigor and scholarly pursuit, all within a framework of specific, divinely revealed directives. The Brigittine order was formally established around 1346, with the founding of the mother house at Vadstena, Sweden. Bridget, who had already gained renown for her mystical visions and political influence, sought to create a monastic community that would reflect the very essence of the early church as she believed it should be. Her rule, which she claimed was revealed to her by Christ himself, was incredibly detailed and prescriptive, covering every aspect of monastic life, from the number of nuns and monks, 60 nuns, 13 priests, 4 deacons, and 8 lay brothers, symbolizing Christ and the 12 apostles and 72 disciples, to the specific cut of their habits. The double monastery structure was unique. While monks and nuns lived in separate cloisters, they shared a common church, with the nuns in an upper gallery and the monks below, and the abbess held ultimate spiritual authority over both. The core philosophy of the Brigittine nuns was centered on a life of intense prayer, contemplation, and diligent study, all directed towards the praise of God and the salvation of souls. Their focus was on the humanity of Christ, particularly his passion and the suffering of the Virgin Mary. They believed that through rigorous adherence to the rule, intellectual engagement with scripture and theology, and constant penance, they could attain deep spiritual union and intercede effectively for the world. Their austerity was a tool for spiritual purification and a necessary component for the intellectual and contemplative life they embraced. A typical day for a Brigittine nun was filled with a demanding schedule of prayer and intellectual work. They rose at midnight for matins and lauds, which were particularly long and complex, reflecting the order's emphasis on elaborate liturgical prayer. After these nocturnal prayers, they would return to their cells for private meditation and study. The remaining hours of the divine office, from prime to compline, were observed communally in the choir, interspersed with periods of study, reading, and manual labor. The Brigittines were particularly known for their intellectual pursuits, dedicating significant time to reading, copying manuscripts, and theological reflection, often using the fruits of their study in their deep contemplative prayer. The enclosure of the Brigittine nuns was strict and absolute. Once a woman entered a Brigittine convent, she was expected to remain there for life. Communication with the outside world was highly restricted and always supervised, typically through a grated window or turnstile in the parlor. Family visits were rare and brief. This rigorous enclosure was seen as essential for maintaining the purity of their contemplative life, protecting them from the distractions and temptations of secular society and fostering an environment of continuous spiritual focus. Apart from the chanting of the divine office and necessary conversations with the abbess or confessor, speech was generally forbidden. Even during meals, silence was observed, with a nun reading aloud from a spiritual text. This pervasive quiet allowed for constant interior prayer and meditation, ensuring that the nuns' minds remained absorbed in spiritual matters and preventing idle chatter or worldly discourse. While the order itself could hold property to support its members, unlike the Poor Clares, individual nuns possessed nothing. Their cells were furnished simply, and personal possessions were limited to the bare necessities. Communities' resources were managed with strict frugality, and any surplus was typically given to the poor. The focus was on communal simplicity and detachment from material comforts, ensuring that the sisters did not become attached to earthly possessions. Their diet was austere and meat-free. Brigittine nuns abstained from all meat and often from eggs and dairy products, relying on a diet of bread, vegetables, beans, and fish. They ate only one main meal a day, often a simple collation in the evening. Fasts were numerous and strictly observed, particularly during Lent, Advent, and on vigils of feast days. Consumption of food was seen as a functional necessity, not a source of pleasure, and the dietary restrictions were a form of bodily mortification intended to promote spiritual discipline. Sleep was limited and intentionally uncomfortable. Brigittine nuns slept on hard beds, often with straw mattresses, in unheated dormitories. Their sleep was regularly broken by the call to nocturnal prayers, a deliberate practice to foster vigilance and prevent excessive indulgence in rest. This rigorous physical discipline was part of their overall commitment to asceticism, designed to strengthen the will and focus the spirit. Their habit was distinctive: a gray or undyed wool tunic, a black veil, and a crown-like white linen cap with 5 small red patches representing the 5 wounds of Christ for the nuns, or a red cross for the monks. This habit was not only simple, but also rich in symbolism, constantly reminding the wearer and observer of their spiritual dedication and their connection to Christ's passion. Plainness of the fabric and the severity of the cut reflected their commitment to humility and simplicity. Work for Brigittine nuns was a blend of spiritual and intellectual labor alongside necessary domestic tasks. While they performed chores like cooking, cleaning, and gardening, a significant portion of their day was dedicated to scholarly pursuits. They were known for copying manuscripts, illuminating texts, translating works, and studying theology and scripture. This intellectual work was seen as a form of prayer and a means of deepening their spiritual understanding, contributing to the spiritual wealth of the monastery and the wider church. Their devotion to study was a unique aspect of their austerity, as it required intense mental discipline and commitment. The Brigittine order quickly spread across Europe, with important foundations in England, Sion Abbey, Italy, Poland, and Germany. Sion Abbey, founded in 1415 by King Henry V, became a significant intellectual and spiritual center in England before the Reformation. These monasteries, while structured according to Brigit's unique rule, maintained a strong emphasis on the contemplative life, intellectual rigor, and profound austerity. Though not as numerically vast as some orders, the Brigittines were known for the disciplined lives of their members and their contribution to scholarship and spiritual literature. Their legacy is one of visionary leadership, strict adherence to a divinely inspired rule, and a profound witness to the integration of intellectual pursuit with intense asceticism in medieval monastic life. Number 5. The Benedictine nuns, early Reformed branches. Long before the Cistercians, Clares, and Brigittines carved out their unique paths of austerity, the rule of Saint Benedict, penned in the 6th century, laid the foundational blueprint for Western monasticism. While many Benedictine monasteries over centuries accumulated wealth and occasionally became less rigorous, certain times and places saw powerful reform movements that sought to restore the original demanding spirit of Saint Benedict's vision. These early reformed branches of Benedictine nuns represent a profound return to fundamentals: radical obedience, humility, ceaseless prayer, and self-sufficiency through hard labor. Their austerity lay not in inventing new disciplines, but in a zealous commitment to the ancient, proven path of the rule. The rule of Saint Benedict, with its emphasis on stability, obedience, and the balance of prayer and work, ora et labora, was revolutionary in its time and became the most influential monastic guide in the West. From the early Middle Ages, women embraced this rule, establishing Benedictine nunneries that became centers of learning, piety, and social influence. However, by the 9th and 10th centuries, many monasteries had grown wealthy, attracting noble women who sometimes brought servants and considerable dowries, leading to a decline in strict adherence to the rule's ascetic ideals. This sparked various reform movements, such as the Cluniac reform, though more focused on men initially, its spirit, independent female houses, and later, independent efforts to restore rigor. These movements aimed to strip away the luxuries, enforce stricter enclosure, re-emphasize manual labor, and bring back the original spiritual intensity that Benedict envisioned. Specific examples include the stricter houses within the Cluniac tradition for women, or independent reforms by abbesses who insisted on a return to basics. For instance, houses influenced by figures like Saint Romuald, founder of the Camaldolese, a very austere Benedictine offshoot, or those that consciously purged wealth and aristocratic privileges. The core philosophy of these reformed Benedictine nuns was a profound spiritual journey towards God through communal life, marked by humility, obedience, and disciplined spiritual practice. They believed that by living simply, praying constantly, and engaging in humble labor, they could transform their souls and contribute to the salvation of the world. Their austerity was therefore a means to an end. Spiritual purity and constant awareness of God's presence. Typical day for a reformed Benedictine nun was precisely ordered around the divine office. They rose very early, typically before dawn, for matins and lauds often sung with great solemnity. The remaining hours of the office, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline, structured their day, calling them back to the choir at regular intervals for communal prayer, psalmody, and scripture reading. Between these periods of prayer, the nuns engaged in spiritual reading, lectio divina, manual labor, and periods of silence and personal reflection. The enclosure of these nuns, especially in reformed houses, was strict. While not always as absolute as the Carthusians or Poor Clares in preventing all outside contact, it aimed to minimize interaction with the secular world. Nuns remained within the monastery walls, and access for visitors was limited, and typically through a grill. This discipline of stability, inherent in Benedictine life, meant a lifelong commitment to one community and a deliberate separation from worldly distractions, fostering an environment conducive to continuous prayer and contemplation. Silence was paramount. St. Benedict's rule devotes significant attention to silence, and the reformed houses enforced this rigorously. Speech was generally permitted only when necessary for spiritual direction or during designated periods in the chapter house. Meals were typically eaten in silence, with a nun reading aloud from a spiritual text. This pervasive quiet was intended to foster interior recollection, allowing the nuns to listen to God and reflect on spiritual matters without the distraction of idle talk. Poverty for these reformed Benedictine houses meant a rejection of personal possessions and communal opulence. While the monastery itself might own property to be self-sufficient, the emphasis was on managing resources frugally and forgoing luxuries. Nuns held no private property and lived simply sharing communal resources. The intention was to avoid the accumulation of wealth that had in some places led to laxity, and to ensure that material goods did not distract from their spiritual focus. Their diet was simple and wholesome, largely vegetarian, with meat often restricted to the sick or specific feast days. They consumed bread, vegetables, beans, and occasionally fish or cheese. Many fasts were observed throughout the year, especially during Lent and Advent, involving reduced meals or abstinence from certain foods. The aim was to foster moderation and self-control, ensuring that bodily appetites did not overshadow spiritual hunger. Sleep was limited and simple. Nuns slept on straw mattresses or simple beds in dormitories, with their sleep often interrupted by the call to nocturnal matins. The intent was not luxury, but adequate rest for their demanding spiritual and physical routine. It was a conscious effort to avoid overindulgence and maintain a disciplined life. Their habit was typically a simple tunic, scapular, and veil, usually in black, hence black nuns. The material was coarse wool, reflecting their commitment to humility and eschewing worldly fashion. The simplicity of their garments was a constant reminder of their vows of poverty and their dedication to a life separated from secular vanity. Manual labor was a cornerstone of Benedictine life and critically re-emphasized in reformed branches. Nuns engaged in various tasks necessary for the self-sufficiency of the monastery: gardening, baking, cooking, cleaning, weaving, and sewing. They might also engage in more specialized tasks, like copying manuscripts or illuminating texts. This labor was not merely practical but spiritual, undertaken in silence and humility as a form of prayer and an antidote to idleness. It physically grounded their contemplative lives, ensuring a balance between spiritual and physical exertion. While not always identified as a single order distinct from the main Benedictine body, the collective influence of these reformed Benedictine nunneries was immense. They played a vital role in maintaining the rigorous spirit of Benedictine monasticism throughout the Middle Ages, often acting as beacons of spiritual renewal. Figures like Saint Hildegard of Bingen, though her community became wealthy later, began in a strict Benedictine setting, and countless lesser-known abbesses and nuns quietly led lives of profound discipline. Convents like those at Fontefraud, which, though independent, had a unique structure and strict rule for both sexes under an abbess influenced by Benedictine principles, or the stricter communities within the reform movements of Gorzay or Cluny, exemplified this return to radical austerity. Their enduring legacy is the continuous testament to the power of the Benedictine rule, a living tradition of disciplined, communal life, prayer, and work that profoundly shaped medieval spirituality and society. They proved that true spiritual freedom came from embracing structured austerity and simple, purposeful living. Number 6. The Dominican nuns. As the 13th century unfolded, Europe was experiencing a vibrant intellectual and spiritual ferment, marked by the rise of universities and the burgeoning mendicant orders. Among these, the Order of Preachers founded by Saint Dominic de Guzman emerged with a unique mission to preach the gospel and combat heresy through scholarship and holy living. While the friars were known for their itinerant preaching, Saint Dominic also established communities of nuns, initially intended to provide a stable, contemplative foundation of prayer and support for the friars' active ministry. These Dominican nuns, known as Nuns of the Order of Preachers, embraced a life of profound enclosure, silence, study, and penance, embodying an austerity distinct from other orders geared specifically towards supporting the intellectual and evangelistic mission of the Dominicans. The first community of Dominican nuns was founded by Saint Dominic himself at Prouille, France, in 1206, even before the formal establishment of the Order of Preachers for Men. This convent was created to shelter women, primarily former Albigensian heretics who had converted, and provide them with a stable, prayerful environment. Dominic envisioned these nuns as the spiritual powerhouse behind the friars' preaching mission. Their life was one of strict enclosure and intense prayer, a constant supplication for the success of the preaching, for the conversion of sinners, and for the purity of Catholic doctrine. Their rule was based on the rule of St. Augustine, common to all mendicant orders but heavily supplemented by the specific constitutions of the Order of Preachers, which emphasized study and poverty alongside contemplation. The core philosophy of the Dominican nuns revolved around contemplation and the sharing of the fruits of contemplation, contemplata alias tradire, a motto often associated with the friars but equally applicable to the nuns' hidden life. For them, this meant living a life of deep prayer and intellectual discipline, not for personal gain alone, but for the salvation of souls and the spread of truth. Their austerity was a rigorous training of body and mind, intended to purify them and make their prayers more efficacious, enabling them to be powerful intercessors for the Church's mission. A typical day for a Dominican nun was marked by a disciplined rhythm of prayer and study. They rose in the deep night, often around midnight, for matins and lauds, chanted communally in the choir. These lengthy prayer sessions were followed by silent meditation and private reading of sacred texts. The remaining hours of the divine office, prime terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline, punctured their day, drawing them back to the choir. Between these communal prayers, a significant portion of their time was dedicated to study, lectio divina, theological reflection, and often the copying of manuscripts or preparation of liturgical texts, reflecting the Dominican emphasis on intellectual pursuit. They lived behind high walls, rarely leaving the convent grounds. Contact with the outside world was minimal, usually restricted to a grated parlor for essential communication with family or confessors, and always supervised. This strict enclosure was deemed essential to protect them from the distractions of the world and to allow them to maintain their focus on contemplation and intercessory prayer. It was a physical manifestation of their total dedication to God. Silence was a deeply observed practice within Dominican convents. Apart from the chanting of the divine office, necessary conversations with the prioress or confessor, and specific times for instruction or communal recreation, silence was strictly maintained throughout the day. Meals were typically eaten in silence, often with a nun reading aloud from a spiritual work or the Constitutions. This quiet atmosphere fostered interior prayer, recollection, and a deeper engagement with their spiritual and intellectual pursuits, preventing idle talk and fostering a serious, prayerful environment. Poverty was an important aspect of their life, aligning with the mendicant ideal. While Dominican nuns did not embrace the absolute poverty of the Poor Clares, their communities could own property and receive endowments. They lived a life of great simplicity and detachment from personal possessions. Their convents were practical and functional rather than opulent, and their cells were furnished sparsely. The emphasis was on communal frugality and the absence of individual wealth, ensuring that material comforts did not impede their spiritual progress. Their diet was austere. Dominican nuns generally abstained from meat for most of the year, with exceptions for the sick or specific feast days. Their meals consisted of simple, nourishing fare, bread, vegetables, pulses, and occasionally fish or cheese. They observed numerous fasts, particularly during Advent and Lent, and on the vigils of major feast days, involving reduced meals or abstinence from certain foods. This dietary discipline was a form of penance, aiming to subdue the flesh and sharpen the spirit for contemplation and study. Sleep was limited and basic. Dominican nuns slept on simple, hard beds or straw mattresses in unheated dormitories. Their sleep was regularly broken by the call to matins in the deep hours of the night, a practice that underscored their commitment to vigilance and sacrifice. The aim was to ensure sufficient rest for their demanding routine, but without any indulgence or comfort. Their habit was distinctive, a white tunic and scapular covered by a black sepa cloak and veil, earning them the name Black and White Nuns. The simplicity of the coarse wool fabric and the lack of ornamentation visually symbolized their humility, poverty, and dedication to God. It was a direct reflection of the habit worn by their male counterparts, emphasizing their shared charism. Work for Dominican nuns encompassed various forms. Alongside domestic tasks necessary for the upkeep of the convent, cooking, cleaning, gardening, sewing, a significant portion of their time was dedicated to intellectual labor. They meticulously copied, illuminated, and preserved manuscripts, produced liturgical books, and engaged in scholarly study of theology, scripture, and the church fathers. This intellectual work was not merely practical but spiritual, seen as a form of prayer and an essential means to deepen their understanding of divine truth, which then fueled their contemplative and intercessory prayer. Their contribution to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge was considerable. Dominican nunneries flourished across Europe throughout the High and Late Middle Ages with foundations in Italy, France, Germany, and Spain. Important houses included San Sisto Vecchio in Rome, where Saint Dominic himself established a community, and Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. Figures like Saint Agnes of Montepulciano, a Dominican nun known for her mystical experiences and strict asceticism, exemplify the profound spiritual lives led within these convents. Though often overshadowed by the more visible preaching friars, the Dominican nuns provided an indispensable foundation of prayer and intellectual rigor. their austere lives serving as a hidden but powerful engine for the order's mission. Their enduring legacy is a testament to the power of a life dedicated to truth, contemplation, and self-sacrifice for the salvation of souls, proving that deep spiritual and intellectual lives could thrive within the most austere of enclosures.